Hi, this is Barry, and welcome to the Simplicity Zen podcast. My guest today is Mushim Patricia Ikeda. She is a Buddhist teacher, author, poet, mentor, and community activist. She teaches meditation retreats for people of color, women, and social justice activists nationally, and is a meditation teacher at the East Bay Meditation Center in downtown Oakland. In September 2015, she received an honorary Doctor of Sacred Theology degree from the Starr King School of the Ministry. As an author, her writings have been published in Lion's Roar, Tricycle, Buddhadharma, and various anthologies. Mushim is a consultant to justice-centered organizations requesting mindfulness training for stress reduction and is often asked to give trainings on disability and access-informed mindfulness. Thank you so much for being here today with us.
Thank you very much, Barry.
Yeah. So as I was telling you before, you first came on my radars because you give teachings at the Sacramento Buddhist Meditation Group here in Sacramento.
Yes, I do.
Yeah. And as soon as I saw one of your talks, I'm like, oh, I got to get her on the podcast.
Thank you.
Yes, I really appreciate you coming. Could you tell us a little bit about, I gave kind of a brief sketch of your current activities, but could you talk a little bit about where your practice is these days? What kind of it seems very service oriented. Could you give kind of just an overview of what you're doing these days and kind of where your interests are?
Thank you very much. Sure, I can. I just recently stepped down from 10 years of being on the administration staff as community director, working with volunteers and in communications for the East Bay Meditation Center in Oakland, California, where I live. And we are a diversity and justice centered, Buddhist based organization, and very large at this point, international community. Filtering all of our Dharma offerings and teachings through the lens of anti-oppression, anti-racist, anti-homophobia, transphobia, ableist, and so forth teachings and movements.
And it's non-denominational Buddhism, right? There's no...
Correct.
Yeah.
However, the founders of this organization, which has had its doors open around 18 years, were mostly trained in the what I guess we would call the American Insight meditation tradition through Spirit Rock and IMS in Barre, Massachusetts, except for me. And I came in to Buddhism through the door of Korean Zen in the early 80s in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Currently, I'm also I'm also called upon as a consultant and a trainer to bring mindfulness practices, mindfulness meditation, applied mindfulness to nonprofits, such as a recent client is a large nonprofit in New York City called Barrier Free Living, and they serve people, mostly women, often with children, who have just left or are still in situations of domestic violence. And they called me in, and all of their clients are people with disabilities. And they called me in to say, well, how can our counselors offer mindfulness meditation, mindfulness practices that will be on the ground and helpful to these mostly women who are in the most stressful situations one can imagine, often having to leave their homes with their kids and figure out, what the heck am I going to do. And I myself was originally a single mother when my now middle-aged child was born, uh, kind of a result of a Zen Buddhist vow of poverty as he become like really poor.
Hmm.
And so I'm very well acquainted with poverty and with being a mother who feels, how can I raise my child in a society where you have to have money for security, for safety, for education, for access to medical care. And that, as you can imagine, gives a whole new slant of how people look at the usefulness of mindfulness, so-called mindfulness practices. I'm also an author, as you mentioned, and I love to write.
Hmm. Could you give an example of, so obviously the clients of this organization, or is clients the right word? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Um, they don't have time, they're in huge transition and turmoil. They don't have times for, multiple classes on mindfulness or something. So what are like very targeted, practical advice you can give to someone in that kind of situation? Like, like specifically, like where can mindfulness intersect for them in an accessible way?
I would say that a short way of putting it, Barry, is to trust that less is more.
Hmm.
If less is also more often. So
Hmm.
instead of thinking of, oh, mindfulness practice means being sitting in a quiet room in a cross-legged position, looking like someone from Yoga Journal with your eyes blissfully closed,
Hmm.
and I don't know, blissing out or something
Don't,
like that.
don't forget the
We,
yoga pants.
pardon?
Don't forget the yoga pants.
Oh, I'm wearing yoga pants, so I have to be careful about that. I am a student of yoga. Uh, I'm just talking about the stereotypical.
Yeah.
However, yes, I understand what you're saying. Thin, too. Can't
Hmm.
have fat people
Right.
or old people
Yeah.
or people with one leg, often. So to try to remove that stereotype, which is a marketing meme,
Hmm.
and to say this is mindfulness practice is something that's on the ground that we can practice in a very simple, brief way, as long as it's called a practice because it needs to be more consistent in
Hmm.
order to help us. And it's not a way of escaping from our reality. It's a way of grounding and centering, getting some perspective, taking a breath and relaxing and saying, okay, what is the most important thing for me to prioritize doing right now? The kids are screaming. I'm very worried about where where my next check is going to come from to pay for groceries. It's really hard to navigate these governmental systems of aid.
Hmm.
Kids need to go to the doctor. I'm overwhelmed. I'm overwhelmed. I'm overwhelmed. I'm going to collapse. And to emphasize that mindfulness is a very practical tool that we can use. So this is secular mindfulness. It's been stripped of Buddhism.
Hmm.
It's not spiritual, it's not religious. It's meant to be a tool that can help us to become aware of what's going on in our bodies, what's happening in our thoughts. Are our thoughts repetitive and closed in and afflictive, like I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail. Well, if we think we're going to fail, we are going to fail.
Hmm.
And how to it's a very understandable fear. So mindfulness can help us become aware our thoughts are racing. We're not in feel it, we don't feel our feet, we don't feel our stomach. So just take a breath, come back to home base and say, okay, let's get a grip and what is it that I can do to help myself and my family right now? What support do I need? What resources do I have? And if I don't actually have enough support and resources, what is my next step? What's my
So,
single next step?
so very practically stop this the spiraling and a degree of stabilization.
Yes.
Hmm. Yeah, which is something I try to do myself too. Yeah.
It's helpful to almost everyone.
Hmm.
And some people have more economic privilege, more health privilege, to have more time to be able to slowly consider certain things.
Hmm.
People who are in emergency situations don't have the luxury of that time. They have to figure out how they're going to get their children fed, how they have to figure out how they're going to get their own healthcare needs enough to keep on going.
Hmm.
And that's, of course, very, very challenging. And mindfulness is not the answer to anything, it's a tool that can help the person just get to that next place where maybe they can get the support to figure things out.
Hmm. Have you got any feedback from this or other organizations where um, that is that it's working? That they're, I mean, obviously the tools work, but are they successfully translating them in the real world to this to these clients? I mean, is it? I'm not really stating this very eloquently, but um, I guess is it a helpful tool in that context? Have you gotten any feedback?
The feedback I've gotten is positive, yes.
Mhm. Yeah.
And it's common sense anyway. You
Hmm.
talked about spinning out, and that's, I think, a good metaphorical use of language
Hmm.
because it has that circular churning, insular locked in quality. The
Hmm.
spinning, we're not seeing the whole situation, right? We're just
Hmm.
spinning and churning. And in Buddhist terms, of course, churning is associated with the samsaric world, the worldly world of all of
Hmm.
our afflictions and death and taxes. And then you said spinning out. And then there's the out. However, in this phrase, out does not mean we're getting to a new place where we're able to have a better perspective. Spinning out usually means we're kind of exiting from our bodies, we're dissociating, and we're not in control of ourselves to be able to help ourselves.
Hmm. That's awesome. So the East Bay Meditation Center is it residential at all, or is it kind of a day practice area? Like, are there residents there?
There are no residents and there are no residential retreats. It's a fairly nice sized rented space
Hmm.
in downtown Oakland near Lake Merritt.
Hmm.
And it has several breakout rooms. It has a one of which has become a lending library and is a multi-purpose room. It has a small office and it has a kitchen where you can't cook. There's a microwave. However, we can make tea
Hmm.
and people can eat food there. There are two wheelchair accessible bathrooms and it's on a corner. So it's very, and it's readily accessible by public transportation, by the BART train and by bus, all of which were requirements, and it's on street level,
Hmm.
requirements of our very active disability community.
Hmm. And how are the demographics as far as age goes? Are you seeing a lot of young people? Is it mostly older? A good mix?
I would say it's a good mix.
Hmm.
And before the pandemic, so we're now that it's not exactly, the pandemic isn't over. However, things are opening up so much more now in 2023. Before the pandemic, we had a very active children family program with lots of screaming little kids running around.
Hmm.
And
That's
we
great.
also had a very active teen mindfulness group.
Hmm.
And and then we have people who are older again, we're access informed, so a lot of people with disabilities and differently abled, including cognitive disabilities, neurodivergence these days.
Hmm.
And we try to have classes and workshops that are open to all, as well as many classes and workshops that are geared for a specific audience, such as self-identified women of color or Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or members of the LGBTQI two-spirit community.
Hmm.
Those are classes that we specialize in.
So these are one-off classes. Are there kind of regularly meeting affinity groups as well?
Yes,
Hmm.
yes, there are a number of weekly meditation-based discussion groups that are identity or affinity centered.
Hmm.
So for instance, our longest running group is the People of Color Sangha. There's also the Alphabet Sangha for LGBTQI
Hmm.
folks, because new letters keep on being added to the alphabet.
Right.
They're very, very active. And we also have a group that is open to all on Friday evenings. We have peer-led groups, we have teacher-led groups. We try to provide a diverse
Hmm.
spectrum of programming in order to serve our diverse community.
Hmm. Do you guys do any? Do you guys have any teacher track training? Because obviously, it's an amalgamation of different traditions and so forth. Um, do you guys have? Is there a tract for becoming a teacher within the organization, or do people go outside of the organization to different lineages or disciplines and then come back with those skills? How does that work with your group?
Both.
Uh-huh.
We, in fact, earlier this year, we graduated our first group of people from a 2-year program, which was called STL, Spiritual Teachers and Leaders program of the East Bay Meditation Center. And they did graduate as Dharma teachers.
Hmm.
I myself have been the founder and guiding teacher of a 1-year program, which is secular mindfulness, called Practice in Transformative Action. And that's secular mindfulness training for social justice activists. It's not a certification program. However, it gears, hopefully prepares the participants to be able to share practices of mindfulness, teach practices of mindfulness, and share them in culturally humble and appropriate ways with people in their workplaces, in their spheres of activist activity, with their families, wherever they're called upon. And that has been a very successful program that just ended its 10th cohort and is now going on hiatus. It's touched hundreds, if not thousands, of people and has produced some very, very fine teachers who are not only justice activists and secular mindfulness practitioners and teachers, they all also are Buddhist teachers and they also are Buddhist practitioners, and they've gone on to teach in a variety of meditation centers.
Hmm. Great. Do you got so the few Vipassana or insight meditation places I've visited, there doesn't seem to be much in the way of, I guess, what we would call service in the Zen world, with the chanting and the bowing and stuff. Do you guys have any aspect of that Buddhist culture, I guess you could
Service,
say?
do you mean the rituals of
Yeah, the rituals, the sutra
bowing?
chanting, bowing. Do you guys have any touch points with that aspect of Buddhism there?
Once again, we're not a totally baby organization. However, we're not that old. We've had our doors open for, I think, 18 years in
Hmm.
Oakland. And I would say the consistent practice that we've had is that people do tend to practice the placing of the palms together, which
Mhm.
in I think Japanese Buddhism is called Gassho.
Mhm.
In Korean Buddhism is called Hapchang, and that respectful bow that seems to be have spread throughout the culture.
Mhm.
We also will often end classes and programs with the dedication of merit, which is also a Buddhist custom.
Mhm.
However, Barry, in terms of service, what your service is, what you're talking in rituals,
Mhm.
such as we'll find in probably most Zen groups, chanting, chanting of various texts,
Mhm.
like this Heart Sutra, possibly bilingually, prostrations, full prostrations, where normally people will prostrate and completely touch the floor, or as Thich Nhat Hanh said, touching the earth,
Mhm.
and wearing special robes, that kind of thing. East Bay Meditation Center has not put that into place, in part because the the mission of the organization is to serve underserved communities who
Mhm.
do not, of people who do not feel comfortable going to many of the other huge number and variety of Buddhist and meditation based groups in the Bay Area,
Mhm.
because they feel excluded, unseen, unheard, shut down. Maybe they show up to a meditation group and everyone is very nice. However, they're very nice white people, and our person is the only person of color and looks around and thinks, this does not feel comfortable to me. This does not feel safe to me.
Mhm.
Or it might be that people unintentionally say things that are offensive and racially ignorant, or ignorant in other ways. And then the person thinks, I'm just never going to come back here because this is not a place that's for me. It's not geared for me. It's not geared for my people. And I
Mhm.
have to find a place where I do feel there are people who look like me, people who self identify as I do, which means that not that everyone has the same experience. However, in rough terms, yes, I have more chances of being with people who we don't have to have certain conversations. We don't have to have the conversation of what's it like to be the what's called the only one,
Mhm.
the only transgender person, the only younger person.
Or they don't have to answer the question, no, where are you from? No, where are you from?
Thank you for raising that. How are you aware of that?
Oh, I've just people of color friends have complained about it to me. Not that I
Yeah,
do it, but just that they all constantly ask that.
thank you for bringing that up, because
Yeah.
I don't hear many people say that. And that is one of the ways in which Asian Americans like myself, I'm a third generation Japanese American. I've never been to Japan. I don't speak Japanese. Would be one of the primary ways in which I experience racism, and it's called being treated as the perpetual foreigner.
Mhm.
And that is exactly what led to the internment of Japanese Americans, citizens in World War II,
Mhm.
who were children who were born in this country, American citizens, and stripped of every civil right and imprisoned
Mhm.
because they were regarded as somehow foreign.
Mhm. So I completely understand the experience of someone coming into an organization that where they don't feel part of the group. There's probably unintentional exclusion, or maybe intentional in some cases. And I totally get people wanting to practice with people they feel comfortable and safe around. Um, how That said, how can larger groups that may currently be mostly white and upper middle class and so forth, you know, I feel everyone benefits from diversity. So are there any strategies that organizations can employ to be welcoming and attract a more diverse sangha? I don't know if I'm saying this really well.
You are saying it quite well, I feel.
Uh,
And the answer is absolutely yes.
mhm,
It's like anything else, it involves a skill set
mhm,
and acquisition of knowledge, listening skills, and the willingness to be uncomfortable,
mhm,
which is actually a pretty big part of. Um, I know that this podcast is about Zen often, and my experience of Zen practice is, and probably all Buddhist practice when we get down to it, involves the willingness to develop the ability to widen our zone in which we become very, very uncomfortable
mhm,
and don't shut down. We're uncomfortable, and it's a kind of discomfort of like, oh, I don't like this, and I'm willing to learn.
mhm. Yeah. Zen in particular, I think suffers from the issue of kind of being generally unwelcoming, regardless of your demo, demographic background. Especially Zen in North America's Japanese Zen. And kind of the Japanese Zen culture is, a lot of people who show up, in Japan, most people who practice Zen are monastics. There's very little lay people practicing. And when you show up as a monastic at a practice center, they're actually purposefully unwelcoming to kind of test the mettle and dedication of the person who wants to join the organization. And obviously it's taken to an extreme degree in Japan compared to here. We're not kicking people off the doorsteps physically or yelling at them or insulting them, to get them to go away and see if they really want to stick around. However, there seems to be a little bit of the vibe of, you know, here's where you sit, follow, just do what other people are doing, and maybe in a couple months or years we'll start talking to you. I mean, that's the extreme, but there's various people along the ways, along the spectrum of where that's true. And um yeah, and so I can imagine it's just like double down, even worse when you come into a group that you're not feeling totally an affinity with. I could see it's something in general. I think Zen, American Zen, can improve with. I think it's a model that doesn't work for lay people who don't really have a Buddhist background and are not already dedicated to the path to feel welcome in. I mean, I've been involved with Zen, for 30 years now in many different groups, and I would say like out of 100 people who come visit, maybe one will stick around for a little while, and maybe one out of 100 of those kind of really dedicate to the path. I mean, our rates aren't good at all, But anyway, I'm soapboxing. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm very interested in what you're saying. And to my knowledge, Barry, when you say Japanese Zen, I believe you mean Japanese lineage.
Yes, that's what I meant. Thank you.
And to my knowledge, there are basically two divisions of Japanese lineage Zen Buddhism, and that's the Soto and the Rinzai.
And also
And
Obaku, which is smaller.
pardon?
Obaku,
Obaku?
yeah, I mean, which arguably is kind of as Renzai, but anyway, it's not worth getting into. Yeah.
Okay, so my cousin, Reverend Chiko Mary Beth Nakade, is a Soto Zen priest on the Big Island of Hawaii.
Mhm.
And her teacher, the former priest, Reverend Tamiya, is Japanese. And he knew he would always go back to Japan at a certain point to take over his father's temple. His
Mhm.
father also is a Soto Zen priest because that's the way it's done in Japan. It's hereditary.
Mhm.
And so I got some insight there into the Soto Zen, Japanese lineage Zen approach to being with lay people.
Mhm.
And it actually is quite welcoming. It's quite
Mhm.
welcoming. because it's not centered on Zazen, on Zen sitting meditation.
Mm-hmm.
It is offered for those who want it, and for those who don't, or for any reason they just don't have the time for it, or the temple offers actually many other activities for people of all ages, all abilities, and is centered on welcoming and hospitality.
Mm-hmm.
This, my cousin's temple in Hawaii, was started by immigrant Japanese
Mm-hmm.
Soto Zen people, and then based in the Japanese American community until more recently, when it is more diverse, yet again centered in the foundation are those Japanese American coffee farmers and everyday lay folks living on the island. And so that form of Japanese lineage Zen did not translate, was not, it didn't translate because it wasn't connected to the arising of predominantly white convert
Mm-hmm.
Japanese lineage Zen Buddhist groups, such as San Francisco Zen Center. The teacher was an immigrant from Japan, Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, and he originally came to serve the Japanese immigrants and Japanese American community in San Francisco. And then some white people, kind of, I guess, of the hippie era, found him and
Beatnik at first, yeah.
said, we're really interested. They were very sincere. We really want to learn to practice. We want to learn what Zen has to offer us. And he said, okay, and started a separate group for them. And that connection between the people who brought Japanese lineage Zen to the United States and the mostly white converts who adopted it as a practice and were very, very interested in learning more for very many reasons, cultural, language, and racism. There wasn't much bridging and there wasn't much communication. And that is something that I've always, for many years, tried to address. That's one of my interests.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point, and one kind of example of that is, I'm probably going to pronounce it wrong, but at least I've been told is that a big part of the temple community interaction is the Obon festival every year. Is that right?
It's going on right now, yeah.
Yeah, and so I mean, which is huge in kind of culturally Japanese Buddhism, which is, I've never seen it practiced in American Zen. I mean, that, I think that's one example of what you're saying there.
And I don't know why, because I mean, Obon Festival is about dancing, community, and people of all ages, little kids, the food, usually there's great food, taiko drumming. It's an honoring of the ancestors, which many people of all groups are into. And mainly, it's really having a good time. I think, to my knowledge, what happened, Barry, when you're talking about the unfriendliness of the convert American Zen groups, to speak in broad terms, is out of really sincerity, no ill will, no hostility at all, out of a sincerity to how can we practice Zen strongly? How can we be really good Zen practitioners and get enlightened? That there was this adoption of a kind of formality and joylessness. It melded with the streams in the United Statesian culture from Calvinism and the idea that in order to be a serious student of Zen, you always had to look serious and you couldn't have joy and you couldn't be just nice to people in a normal way. That
And
was
you have to suffer a little bit.
you have to suffer a lot, and you have to make other people suffer.
Hmm.
It would not be uncommon in what my friend Robert Aitken Roshi called the bad old days of American Zen, for again very sincere people who had young children to leave them alone without any care at all and go off to the meditation
Hmm.
hall and leave them. I mean, social services would take those children away.
Oh, wow.
I mean, that just was a fairly common phenomenon, I'd say, in the early days of the convert Zen.
Wow. Not healthy, definitely. So you mentioned you're third generation?
I am.
Yeah. So did you have was there any touch points for Buddhism in your upbringing then?
Thanks for asking. As a Japanese American, we count the generations as we say the first generation, the Issei, they're actually immigrants. They came from Japan.
Hmm.
Then there were the Nisei, who were all born in the United States. My parents were Nisei, and then I am the Sansei, or third generation,
Hmm.
born again in the United States. We're citizens of the United States. And remind me of the question and again.
Oh, growing up, did you have any touch points
Oh, yeah.
with Buddhism through your family or your community or anything like that?
Thanks. So I grew up in Ohio.
Uh-huh.
We were racially and culturally almost completely isolated. I grew up in the rural area near Akron, Ohio, in the central part, a little bit northern central part of the state. And many of my classmates were from families from West Virginia who had come up for the parents to work in the tire factories in Akron, Ohio, which was called the tire capital of the world. Firestone, Goodyear, Cyberling, all of the tire manufacturers were
Mhm.
there. And so many of my classmates in public school growing up were Appalachian and very proud of it. There were a lot of Baptists. It was called the Bible Belt. And Catholics were actually a kind of exotic minority.
Mhm. Probably no Jews.
There may have been one family that didn't declare itself as such. My parents did not go to church.
Hmm.
They never talked that much about religion. My father was anti-Christian in the sense of he said that his experience of Christians were they said one thing and then they did another.
Hmm.
My mother was more tolerant and open-minded. Her values were much like the Dalai Lama's: kindness, generosity. She was a wonderful manager. She was a great mother. She became one of the first women pharmacists. And however, we found out as we were growing up that she did come from a Buddhist family.
Hmm.
Her family, her parents had immigrated from Japan to Hawaii, which we can call our Buddhist state in the United States of America. There are a lot of Buddhists there,
Hmm.
and both her parents were Buddhist.
Do you
Her
know
father,
do you know
her
what type of
father was,
Buddhist?
yeah, her father was Soto Zen,
Uh-huh.
layperson.
Hmm.
Her mother was Jodo Shinshu, Shin Buddhist. They had a mixed marriage.
So it's like two Dankas then.
Yes,
Or could be in the community of.
yes. And so my mother did as a young child, her parents were Buddhists. They had Buddhist communities of practice. And then World War II came. I think she was around 8 or something like that. And all of the Buddhist temples were shut down. The Japanese based, probably all of them were shut down. And the priests were actually arrested and interned, some of them in their robes.
Was your mom's family interned?
No, because in Hawaii, you're on an island and the American military was there. And so there was nowhere to go.
Hmm.
So most of those people were not interned. However, community leaders were interned, and those included Buddhist priests, as well as through marriage. I'm not related by blood, but I do have a family member who was my uncle's father on the big island of Hawaii, who was an immigrant from Japan. And he was arrested and interned because in order to make a few dollars for his family, among many other things, he would write letters for immigrants from Japan who were not that literate. They would come to him and they'd say, I need to write a letter to the government of Japan regarding my visa. And they would pay him money and he would write letters for them. And because it was considered that he was corresponding with the government of Japan, he was interned. And in fact, he was murdered by a guard in an internment camp.
It's horrible. Sorry.
It is horrible. And that's, again, part of the culture and the legacy of the immigrant Japanese. Many of them were Buddhists. That has not been known and that has not been directly connected to the experience and the practice of the predominantly white convert Zen Buddhists in this country. And slowly, some of those connections are being made right now. It's something that I'm very involved in, and I think is important to acknowledge.
Are you familiar with Wakamatsu Farm out here outside of Sacramento?
No, tell me more.
Oh, it's kind of a tangent. Sorry, just made me think about it. It was the site of the first Japanese colony in North America here in El Dorado County.
No.
Oh, interesting. It'd be way too.
I'll Google it though.
Yeah, okay, because they've had some programs about this, and so it's too much of a tangent, so I won't go into it. Maybe we could talk about it afterwards. Yeah. So you mentioned that you learned later that your mom came from a Buddhist family, so which implies it was not talked about at all when you're growing up. Is that right? Am I reading that right?
It wasn't a major topic of discussion. Like many Nisei or second generation, what we call second generation Japanese Americans, my parents were in a certain way in favor of assimilation. My father was born on a farm in Indiana as Yoshizo Ikeda. And when he became of age, I'm not sure exactly when he became a legal adult, he went to a lawyer and changed his name to Robert, his first name to Robert, so that in the 50s, one of the most, we think of what's an American male name, Bob. He became
Right.
Bob.
Yeah.
And he anglicized his name to be pronounced Ikeda in order to try to become more palatable and more American sounding. Buddhism, likewise, was not considered to be an American religion, and I've never even known whether his parents and his family espoused any kind of spiritual or religious beliefs at all. On the other hand, my mom grew up in Hawaii, which, as I said, is our Buddhist state in the United States of America. And there were, before the war started, there were temples, there were all kinds of activities going on. And so her family, who remained in Hawaii and in touch with, they are Buddhist. And we would hear about that in just little references when our relatives from Hawaii came to visit us. They did not proselytize us at all. However, looking back, I can see that their values of kindness, of generosity, represented much of what is best in Buddhism. Yes, we know though His Holiness the Dalai Lama has said we don't need to be Buddhist. He said my religion is kindness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you? So you sounds like you grew up very atheist or agnostic.
We grew up as nothing.
Mm-hmm.
It, my father was not atheist. He loved to fish. That was his main thing. And he loved nature. He grew up on a farm. He
Mm-hmm.
loved nature. And he once said to me when I was really little, he said, daughter, when I look around, he said, all we need to do is look around. When we see how beautiful the world is, we know that there has to be a creator.
Mm-hmm.
That was his private conviction. So
Mm-hmm.
I guess he was agnostic in a way.
Mm-hmm.
My mother just never said for or against. She was for people being fair and kind.
Mm-hmm.
And then um and then slowly we began to hear little references or little things. Interestingly enough, Barry, since this podcast is called Simplicity Zen, I visited my relatives in Hawaii uh, twice as a child growing up. And some of
Mm-hmm.
them came out to visit us in Ohio, but only twice. And one was when I was 5 years old, and one was when I was around 13 years old. On that second trip, my maternal grandfather, my grandpa Sawada, showed me, I was his firstborn grandchild, and he always liked me. And he showed me how he did calligraphy with in the Japanese style with brush and ground his own ink.
Mm-hmm.
And he did calligraphic scrolls of Buddhist material.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, he was the calligrapher for his Soto Zen temple. I don't know where he learned it. And one of his practices, which is very common in Japan and is done by Japanese Zen Buddhists, is to copy out the Heart Sutra,
Mm-hmm.
say once a day, or if not once a day, quite often. That was one of his practices. And so the little bungalow where the family lived was full of these copies of the Heart Sutra that he had calligraphed with a brush and ink in on cheap shelf paper, very cheap paper, because it was a practice. And there were hundreds of them just rolled up into little scrolls around, and many more had been burned or had been thrown away. And as a child of 13 years old, I remember being really interested in that. He showed me how to do some brushwork, and I brought home to Ohio with me one of those copies of the Heart Sutra on cheap shelf paper,
Mm-hmm.
and I had it framed when I was in high school.
Oh, do
And
you still have
that
it?
I still have it. That
Oh, that's so cool.
thing has followed me
Oh, that's great.
for all these years.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, especially this stayed a lot considering you literally did a vow of poverty and probably didn't keep much with you that you kept that.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I left it behind when I entered Zen training. I brought it with me into the Zen Buddhist Temple, Ann Arbor, Michigan,
Mm-hmm.
which was just starting up. And when I left that temple, I left it behind there, and they had it on the wall since it is a Heart Sutra. And then many years later, the teacher from that temple, who had been the temple director at the time I was there, came from Ann Arbor, Michigan, out to the Bay Area in California, where I live now, for a meeting of
Mm-hmm.
American Zen teachers in San Francisco. And she said to me, let's get together for tea when I come. And she also said, I'm willing to pack up and bring your grandpa's copy of the Heart Sutra with me, which was quite a thing to bring it on the airplane, because it has
Mm-hmm.
glass in it. And she
Right.
carefully packed it and brought it, and it was returned to me so many years later.
Oh, that's a great story. Um, when you visited your family in Hawaii, were there any aspects of Japanese culture that resonated with you or surprised you? Or, like For example, would your parents cook any Japanese cuisine at home that, maybe you tried for the first time in Hawaii, anything like that?
Yes and yes. So the Japanese American culture in Hawaii is became distinctly part of the diverse meeting of many Asian cultures, some Buddhist, some Christian, in the Hawaiian Islands. And they
Mhm.
have their own history, and everything got blended with what was there. So my mother and her family used some Hawaiian words. They would speak pidgin English, eat foods that were there. There are
Mhm.
avocados on the trees and mangoes on the trees and passion fruit, tropical fruit. Um,
Papayas.
yes, and yeah, lots of papayas. And and again, their culture became one that was distinctly Hawaiian Buddhism with roots in Japan. However, it wasn't solely Japanese anymore. So there were many surprises because I grew up in Ohio. I
Mhm.
didn't even understand some of the things they were saying, many of the references. My cousins in Hawaii were culturally quite unlike me,
Mhm.
and that was a journey of learning and discovery. At the same time, to address the second part of the question you asked me, and thank you for asking, Barry, the way that my family and my parents preserved our identity as Japanese Americans living in Ohio was in our culture at home.
Mhm.
And there was a very distinct boundary between who we were at home and who we were outside of the home. Outside of the home, we were trying to blend in, we were trying to be assimilated to look like real Americans.
Mhm.
And in the home, we were distinctly always reminded that we were of Japanese heritage. We ate Japanese white rice, which my parents had to travel all the way, several hour ride to Cleveland, Ohio. There was one Japanese supply store there, and they would go every few months. It was always a big deal. We would go and we would get several sacks of Japanese white rice and then some other treats that we would bring back. And every once in a while, for a treat, my mother would make shrimp tempura and vegetable tempura,
Mhm.
and my father particularly liked it. We all liked it. It was so tasty. And we ate other Japanese kinds of foods as well, sometimes from supplies sent to us by our relatives in Hawaii.
Mhm.
And we were always told we are we are Japanese Americans, and we're
Mhm.
different in the sense of we're taught to be respectful to our elders. Like sometimes I would visit my friends' homes, and their parents would say, "Oh, just call me Alan, or
Mhm.
just call me,
Bob.
yeah, Luella or Bob." And
Mhm.
I never could because my parents would say, "You cannot do that. You always have to address people as Mr. or Mrs."
Mhm.
And you can see that's part of like the Confucian culture,
Mhm.
part of those Japanese culture, where if someone is your elder and someone is your friend's parents, you always have to show respect.
Yeah. I guess there's like multiple versions of, I guess, sir or mister in Japan based on your relationship to them, is my understanding of
That's
it.
my understanding as well. And
Yeah.
certainly my training was in Korea,
Mhm.
and age again, chronological age is huge in the secular society. In the monastic society, it's also, in addition to that, you have ordination age,
Mhm.
how many years you've been an ordained monastic, where you are in in the hierarchy of seniority.
Mhm. I'm curious, what got you interested in Buddhism?
Thank you for asking. My original interest in training was in poetry.
Hmm. This is in college.
Even before that,
Hmm.
growing up in Ohio as a little kid, as soon as I learned how to write. I was a very early reader. And as soon as I learned how to write words, I immediately wrote a little book.
Hmm.
It's called The New Day. And it was very short. It was all one sentence because I hadn't learned to punctuation. And interestingly enough, it was a revision of the tale of Pandora's box from Greek mythology.
Hmm.
And because I was again raised to be a very obedient and respectful child, in my version of the story, there were two children and my brother and me, basically. And the story says, and an old woman came and gave them a box and said, "Do not open this box." And they did not. And so they lived happily. And then I ran out of space on the paper, so I couldn't put ever after, and it ends, and so they lived happily. I've always been a writer, and then at an early age, I began to read and write poetry. I went on to do my undergraduate work at Oberlin College in Ohio, which was just starting a creative writing program. And there were so many opportunities there. I found wonderful mentors and teachers and peers, all very interested in poetry in English, as well as some poetry in translation. And I even had the opportunity, Barry, to begin teaching poetry writing as an undergraduate.
Oh, cool. What
And
was the appeal of all the different types of writing and literature? What's the appeal of poetry in particular?
thank you for asking. Poetry in particular, though, of course, I loved novels. Some writers in the United States and elsewhere, I guess, in the United States, were beginning to experiment with a cross genre called the prose poem.
Hmm.
Poetry in particular appealed to me because as I learned it in the legacy of like William Carlos Williams and some of the American poets, the Imagist poets, I think that they were called, poetry operates through imagery.
Hmm.
I think it was William Carlos Williams. Someone said, I think it was William Carlos Williams, who famously said, "A poem does not mean but be." In other words, a poem is only itself. We can't say this is a poem about a plum in a refrigerator. That gives you some information. It's not the poem. The poem is only itself,
Hmm.
and it communicates in a unique way in which the poet expresses through a sequence of images as well as the rhythm and cadence and lineation, broken lines, and then the start of a new line, the visual appearance on the page, indicating certain pauses. Through rhythm and through image, the poem evokes, does not describe, but evokes, brings forth an experience for the reader, if it's working well enough, that is multidimensional. It may have narrative aspects. It may also, on a kind of horizontal plane, a
Hmm.
story unfolding in time, or not. It may also have, and almost always has, that vertical axis, which we might equate with a spiritual experience, of a direct experience of something that is quite intimate and available to us in everyday life, and is often buried and not contacted because of our busyness and our conventional way of thinking about things.
Hmm. When you first kind of noticed poetry, did it invoke anything in you? Like, did it capture you? Like, right away,
Yes.
or is it something you kind of gradually came to appreciate?
Yes, my parents were like many Asian American and like many Japanese American parents, their goal was for all of their children to go to college.
Hmm.
And any interest we showed that we wanted to be educated about anything, they would buy us books and musical instruments, and they were very, very supportive in that way. And as soon as I started reading some poetry, I became interested. And I remember them giving me fairly young a thick, a thick, big book with illustrations in it of all different kinds of poetry in English, geared for, say, children from maybe age 11 through high school
It wouldn't
age.
be a light in the attic, would it? That came later, right?
No, I can't remember what it was. It might have been called something like the Random House
Mhm.
Anthology of Poetry. It's huge, and it contained everything from Walt Whitman to Shakespeare to Elizabeth Bishop. It didn't contain any poetry in translation. However, it contained poetry in English from many different eras and the United States and England. And I read that thing from start to finish and knew all of that poetry. It opened up the world of poetry to me, and I began writing my own poetry and actually receiving awards and being published when I was in high school.
That's great. Um, Looking back from a practice point of view, do you think it kind of opened up like no mind or not knowing or anything like that? Did it kind of mess with your neurochemistry a little bit and in how you perceive the world?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
I've mentioned William Carlos Williams several times, and his poetry has been compared to haiku,
Mhm.
operating again through images.
Mhm.
And in fact, you can't see it, but what I'm pointing to on this computer hutch, I keep a postcard that has a poem by William Carlos Williams. It's very famous, that says, "It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there."
Mhm.
And I grasped that intuitively at a very, very young age. And when I was an undergraduate in college, I began reading the poetry and the essays of Pulitzer Prize winning poet Gary Snyder,
Mhm.
who is still very much alive
Yeah, I've
in
met him.
Northern California,
Yeah. Mhm.
right? Yeah, up near at
The Ring of
the
Bones
Ring
and
of Bone Zen
right.
Dome.
Yeah.
He and his friends built it.
Mhm.
And I was there in Ohio again as an undergraduate in college, and I began reading it. And something about the way he wrote about Zen Buddhism and the crossover between Japanese Zen Buddhism, of which he was a very serious practitioner and went to Japan and did the training, that
Mhm.
crossover between that and American nature-centered poetry, ecological consciousness.
Is this
But,
the Transcendentalists?
pardon?
Transcendentalists? Is this what you're referring to,
No.
or does it predate
Um,
that?
for
Or was
Gary
it?
Snyder, one of his jobs was, he I think went into like the Department of Forestry, and he was stationed at a lookout
Mhm.
by himself in a lookout tower looking out over a forest to spot wildfires and call them in. And that overlapped significantly with Zen Buddhism, the Zen love of nature, of mountains and rivers,
Mhm.
a certain kind of ecology, even, and environment and landscape, and the direct and intimate contact with what would be considered, I think, my understanding and experience of Zen Buddhism is that it's not just human beings and animals and birds that are alive. The mountains are alive. The waters are alive. The sky is alive.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is is part of who we are. So there isn't a separation between what we call nature and human nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dogen, I'm going to mess up the quote, but he says something like, even pebbles, tiles, and walls teach the Dharma.
Very much so, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And Gary Snyder brought that understanding along with an emphasis on community living and an alternative to consumer lifestyle early on into his books of essays, such as the one I remember most is called Earth Household.
Mm-hmm.
And I read that and I thought, there is something here that is just calling to me. I can't even say what. It was very instinctive. And years later, I began reading as much about Zen, Japanese Zen, because that's all I found, written in English as I could. And I just felt I don't know what it is. There's something here. It's something about the poetry. It's something about the environmental consciousness and the love of nature. It's something about a way of being in the world in balance with everything else
Mm-hmm.
that is something that I really desire to enter into more, particularly because I'm going to be 70 in January of 2024, and I am a product of the Cold War era in the
Mm-hmm.
United States. When we lived as school children, we were constantly doing harebrained things like atomic bomb air raid drills,
Sure.
nuclear air raid drills, like that was going to save us.
Yeah, even at my age, we did the whole go under the desk thing.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I didn't know
I think
that.
I think I was the
So,
last of the generation that did that.
okay.
Early 80s, late
And how
70s.
old are you, if I may ask?
50.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
good for me to know because really at this moment, this is the end of July 2023. The headlines are that Christopher Nolan, the filmmaker, has released the film Oppenheimer
Mm-hmm.
about the one of the makers of the atomic or nuclear bomb.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, I can say that what came across to me in my readings about Zen Buddhism not only involved a love of and our place in the natural world and the preservation of the health of mountains and rivers and waterways and streams and oceans and the many beings. What also came across to me was an acknowledgement that everything that is born will die.
Mm-hmm.
And my generation was looking at the death of the planet.
Yeah. I remember even as a kid, every time I'd hear a big boom, I'd be like, "Oh, is this it? Is this nuclear war?" It was just was like a constant, background radiation almost of reality that at any moment it could just all be wiped out. Yeah,
So interesting. I've never spoken to another person of your age who
yeah,
has said that that was so formative.
and there was even there was a mini series on TV. I remember The Day After or something like that. I remember that
I
was,
don't remember
yeah,
that.
yeah, that was huge. Um, I'm curious with the poetry. Did you have any early um, encounters with like Hanshan or Ryokan or any of those Zen poets from
Yeah,
China or Japan?
yes. So
Yeah.
my major mentor at Oberlin College in Ohio as an undergraduate poet is a poet named David Young, who is still alive,
Hmm.
still producing poetry. He's in Ohio. He's retired as a professor. And one of his passions was working with scholars who knew primary languages of poets he was interested in And a book that he published in several editions is called, I think, Four Tang Dynasty Poets. And then he
I haven't
added
seen
one, I
that.
think it was called Five.
Mhm.
And Oberlin College had a press at that time and published the translations, which my mentor David Young did, of some major Tang Dynasty poets, such as Li Po, working with a scholar who knew the original Chinese and
Mhm.
who did the first rough translate, and then he would work in collaboration. So he
Mhm.
wasn't making things up. He was working in a culturally and non-appropriate, sensitive, non-appropriative way, and then bringing the poems to life with a freshness and a contemporary voice for American poets such as myself. And that there was something about the poems in those books. I still have. Uh, I bought my repurchased a copy in the last few years and began reading those poems again and feeling how directly they that they speak
Mhm.
to me today, because many were written during a time of war in China.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, so would it be safe to say poetry was your direct link to Zen practice or practice in general?
It was, as well as um, desperation.
Mhm.
I wouldn't have known how to say this. I was miserable. I
Mhm.
was anxious. I was depressed. I was looking for a way to stabilize myself.
Mhm.
And my graduate degree, again, is in poetry writing from the University of Iowa Graduate Writers Workshop. There were some of the most talented writers in the nation who went through that program. It's the most famous writing program in the world, arguably. And if you get a degree from there, which I do have, it's quite prestigious.
Mhm.
And the artist communities were so vital. They were so creative, Barry, and they were so dysfunctional.
Mhm.
Alcoholism, drug addiction, mental illness, all kinds of sexual behaviors which were destructive.
Mhm.
And I come from the era of drug, sex, and rock and roll, so I am not speaking in any prudish way. I'm talking about relationships being
Mhm.
destroyed through sexual misconduct and so forth,
Mhm.
infidelity. And and I was part of all of that. And I had the good sense to know I'm not going to last that long. I'm not that tough. I don't do well with substances.
Mhm.
And I saw people around me burning out. Some were sent to the emergency ward, some were sent to psych wards. And I thought, I do not want this to happen to me. I have to find a way to stabilize myself.
Did you, I mean, what were you part of, like a hippie culture? Would that be the exaggeration?
I would say I was right at the end of the hippie culture.
Mhm.
I would say I was right post hippie. I would call myself post hippie.
Did you have any interactions with psychedelics or anything like that?
That's why I say that. When I was in undergraduate college in Oberlin, I would say, from my knowledge, that was the very, very end. I graduated in 1975. I would say that was the very, very end of the LSD period.
Mhm.
And I did take LSD once. I don't know what that was, but whatever it was cut with something. It was old. Who knows? It was not a memorable experience.
It wasn't flowers and rainbows.
No, it was almost nothing,
Yeah. Oh,
really.
okay.
I mean, there was something, there were like some visual hallucinations, but even then, I had enough mindfulness to think this is chemistry acting on my brain. It is not interesting in
Mhm.
the least. I did not have a spiritual experience
Mhm.
through psychedelics at all. I knew people who did,
Mhm.
And also, I don't know, just because of the way that my whole family is like this, genetically, we don't do well with substances.
Hmm.
We just don't do well with alcohol and drugs. We're not attracted to that. And because of that, a text I read when I was in undergraduate college that a friend of mine who was interested in psychedelics loaned me was by Dr. Andrew Weil. I think that's how he pronounces his name, Weil, who's still around these days. And it was called The Natural Mind. And his thesis as a scientist and as a doctor was to say human beings have an innate attraction to getting high.
Hmm.
Kids will get high by whirling around in circles and hyperventilating.
Hmm.
People want to get high in order to have alternative experiences, and that then in indigenous cultures, this wasn't getting high for recreational purposes. These
Hmm.
were part of sacred ceremonies, it was part of spirituality, it was part of indigenous religion. And his startling conclusion, as I recall, is that, so this again was it was around 1974 that I read it. His startling conclusion was that we do not need substances, that these are changes that occur in the human brain, which give us access to an alternative experience of being alive, and that it can all be done without substances through meditation.
Hmm. So you read that and that resonated.
I read that and I thought, okay, I don't have to do drugs. Well, let's
Hmm.
go on to something like meditation. Now, it took me a while to get there.
Yeah. Did you mention to me once that Gary Snyder actually personally recommended Zen for you? Is that right? Am I remembering that right?
No,
Or you
what it
read
was
it
is
from him or something?
I read his
Okay.
poetry and I read his essays,
Okay.
and I felt, oh, there's something here that's calling to me. Fast forward some years later, I did become a student of Zen again in Ann Arbor, Michigan,
Hmm.
and I wrote a card to Gary Snyder through his publisher,
Hmm.
and I thanked him, and I received a card back from him.
Oh, that's great.
I said, it's because of you, Gary Snyder, that I have become a student of Zen. Thank you. And he wrote me back a very nice card.
Oh, nice. What lineage was the Ann Arbor? That was your first practice place? Ann
Yes,
Arbor was it? And what was the lineage there?
Korean Zen.
Korean Zen. Uh-huh. Um, so you'd read that, you got to you can get to these spaces through meditation. Was that a direct link to I need to find a place to practice, or did you try practicing at home, or like how did you actually begin Zen practice itself, or any meditation practice?
After reading every book I could find, I'm a fast reader too, or used to be, every book I could find on Zen
Mm-hmm.
in English, and that was all Japanese Zen.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even know there was Korean Zen or Chinese Chan or Vietnamese anything. Tien. After reading all the books, they all said the same thing. And they all said, it will do you no good to read these books. You have to find a teacher and you have to learn how to practice Zen meditation. And
Mm-hmm.
I thought this must be the truth, because it's not just one or two. They all say the same thing. And I didn't know where to access Zen meditation. At the end of my second year of the 2-year program, graduate program, Master of Fine Arts in Poetry Writing in Iowa City, I was going through an existential crisis. And I remember sitting on my bed cross-legged. I had no idea what I was doing. I needed to desperately find some stillness and try to stabilize and ground myself in some way. But I had no instruction. I had no idea what I was doing. And then I did see an ad for, I don't even know what it said, for a group in Iowa City that did Buddhist practice. And I went there a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
They never said that they were a Tibetan lineage Buddhist group, but they were.
Mm-hmm.
And the teacher was, I believe, a Tibetan teacher who would come maybe once a year
Mm-hmm.
and drop in. However, they never said that either. They never said anything. All they did was they got together, they did chanting, and then they were very friendly and they'd shake hands. They never explained anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I began doing that chanting practice, and I enjoyed that, and that helped me quite a bit. But I didn't know what language was in. Again, they were a very terse group. They just never explained anything. I kind of vaguely knew they were Buddhist, and they were friendly. That's all.
Mm-hmm.
After Iowa City, I went on to a job, an office job in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I went to the spiritual bookstore in town, which was called Shaman's Drum. And they had a wall in the stairwell where community groups could post spiritual posters about their activities. And there was one flyer that said Zen Buddhist Temple, Ann Arbor.
Mm-hmm.
It had a reproduction or a copy of the so-called sixth patriarch or ancestor, Huineng, ripping up texts and looking like quite the scoundrel.
Mm-hmm.
And it said Zen Buddhist Temple Ann Arbor. It didn't say anything about Korean anything, just said Zen, which is a Japanese word, Zen Buddhist Temple Ann Arbor. And it said that they had meditation practice and also sold meditation cushions.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me quite a while because I thought, what if they are a cult? I don't want to get captured by a cult. And I thought, I will purchase a meditation cushion and check them out before I even try meditating with them because I know nothing about them and I have safety issues. And so I called down and went down and gave a check to a white American monk
Mm-hmm.
who sold me a cushion. And then I was busy just trying to survive and earn a living. And several months later, at that point, we often had phone numbers on our checks.
Mm-hmm.
He called me and said, our teacher, Samu Sinim, is coming down this Sunday from Toronto, our mother temple in Toronto, the Zen temple in Toronto. Would you like to come and meet him? And I said, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my first experience. There was meditation, again, no instruction, very
Right.
Zen. They just don't give you a hand in the old days. However, I'm good at sitting quietly, so I just sat quietly, and then we had tea, and there was a chance. I think the teacher may have given a Dharma talk. I can't remember. I had a chance to talk to the teacher who was fluent in English. He'd been in
Was he
Canada
Korean?
for many years. Yes, he just
Mm-hmm.
passed last year.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a question, and my question was, I'm trying to find a way to a spiritual life. However, the harder I try, the more I notice, the more judgmental I become.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not happy about this, but I don't know how to, will you give me some help?
Mm-hmm.
And he started telling this long, shaggy dog story that didn't seem to answer my question at all. And I don't even remember what it was. It was some long Zen story, and it wandered here and it wandered there. And then he stopped, and I looked at him like, what good is this to me? And he said, so you see, you can practice anywhere. That was the takeaway. And that made a mark on me because he didn't say, you have to become a Zen monk, you have to do this, you have to do that. He just said, you can practice anywhere. And my brain said, I want to learn what is behind that.
Did you start practicing there pretty quickly after that?
Yes.
Uh-huh. And at this point, you realize, well, this is Korean Zen, huh?
Yes.
Uh-huh. Was that, did that matter to you?
No.
No.
I was interested though, because I never heard of Korean Zen, which is called Sôn. However, they called it Zen since that's
Right.
what
It's
most
American loan
Americans,
word. Yeah.
yeah, most Americans relate to it as. Um, since I didn't know anything about anything, I just accepted that I was learning something.
Hmm.
And they did provide a beginner's class in Zen meditation that had certain characteristics of Japanese Zen, because the teacher had also trained as a Zen monk in Japan prior to coming to North America. So, for instance, we used the Japanese round cushions to sit on, the
Hmm.
zafus, and we actually made them.
Hmm.
And those are not Korean at all.
Hmm. What was your opinion of meditation at first? Zen meditation?
I really liked it.
It felt.
Again, my training and my personality is that of a poet,
Hmm.
and I think he was an American poet named Edgar Lee Masters, 19th century, I believe, American poet. And I think I once read that someone said to Edgar Lee Masters, "So, how was your day today?" And Edgar Lee Masters said, "I worked on my poem." He was in, I think, the American South. He said, "So I went out and after breakfast and I sat down on the front porch and I rocked for a while and I thought about my poem. And I thought about my poem. I thought about my poem. And then I had lunch and then I went out and I rocked for a while on the porch. And then I took out a comma from one of the lines." So you see there, that kind of repetition, the openness to not knowing,
Hmm.
and the ability to simply be with things as they are and be open, uh, without trying to manufacture something. That is often, I think, the nature of who we are as poets.
Hmm.
If we can quell our little anxieties or our big anxieties and have that ability, and that translates directly into Zen meditation. With Zen meditation, we have the addition of certain postures.
Hmm.
The posture of meditation is a yogic asana. And
Hmm.
so there's a discipline of the body in addition to the discipline of the mind. And that I was pretty good at, not without pain. However, I can do it again because of being Japanese American. We sat on the floor a lot to watch TV and do things.
Hmm.
I can do, even I'm almost 70, I can sit cross-legged on the floor fairly
How about
easily.
Seiza? Would you guys say Seiza?
No,
No.
never did.
Yeah, I can take like 2 seconds of Seiza and then emergency almost immediately.
My legs go to sleep immediately.
Yeah. Yes.
However, we would sit cross-legged a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I could do the Zen meditation, and I almost immediately began to get the benefits of it, in that I was able to slow down, I was able to calm down,
Mm-hmm.
and as a poet, I work through images, through sounds, through phenomena manifesting
Mm-hmm.
in the world around me. Thus, for instance, I would really enjoy, during a longer period of Zen meditation, being in a quiet room and over the hours seeing the angle of sunlight change in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an event.
Mm-hmm. Um, we talked earlier in the podcast about how people of color will go into a place that's predominantly white and middle class and not feel welcome. Did you have that experience going to the Zen Center at all?
I'm glad you asked this because I count myself as so fortunate, Barry. I've been part of the so-called Buddhist of color movement in the Bay
Mm-hmm.
Area that has now spread across the United States and up into Canada and globally.
Mm-hmm.
And that Zen Buddhist temple in Ann Arbor, Michigan was multicultural, multiracial, and diverse
Mm-hmm.
because Ann Arbor, Michigan is a university town.
Mm-hmm.
University of Michigan is there, and we drew on members of the student body on one hand. For instance, we did have a practitioner who was from Japan studying at University of Michigan
Mm-hmm.
at this Korean Zen lineage temple. He was one of our Sangha members. And we also had people who were looking for an alternative lifestyle and were from working class backgrounds. The original Sangha or spiritual community that formed around this startup temple in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is still there, is quite well established now, the Zen Buddhist Temple Ann Arbor, we consisted of people of European American, African American,
Mm-hmm.
people from other countries, including Japan, Mexico, other countries as well, Asian Americans. We were incredibly diverse, and we also, it was very clear that we were the child, and our mothership was Canadian
Mm-hmm.
in Toronto. And often when our Canadian Sangha siblings came down to do retreats with us or practice, or I was also sent up to do some work in the Toronto temple, they made it very clear as Canadians that they did not want to take any crap from Americans. They did not like American ignorance of the history of Canada, and they did not appreciate American supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
So I was trained to be very respectful to Canadians.
Mm-hmm. Like you have to say a boot instead of about. No, I'm just joking.
They don't all do that. They are
I'm
diverse
totally kidding.
as well. So for instance, we had a connection to Zen students in Mexico City
Mm-hmm.
because one of the steady Sangha members at our temple in Toronto is Mexican Canadian.
Mm-hmm.
She had grown up in Mexico City.
Mm-hmm.
And so she connected both of our temples to Zen Buddhists in Mexico City who didn't have Sanghas, who didn't have teachers. And we went down there in December of 1984, and we did a retreat with the Mexican Zen Buddhists in a rented facility out in the countryside. Our teacher was a teacher, and therefore we were members of the Toronto Sangha, the Ann Arbor, Michigan Sangha, and then Zen practitioners who were Mexican. It was quite an amazing experience.
So during this time of your life, did you have a direct teacher that you worked closely with?
Yes, the teacher and founder of the group was Korean Zen teacher Samu. That's his Dharma name, Sinim. Sinim is an honorific meaning monk or nun,
Mm-hmm.
venerable. It's non-binary in terms of gender. And he had grown up during the Korean War, had become orphaned, and was taken in, as I understand it, by a bunch of Buddhist monks.
Mm-hmm. And so what were the touch points? Would you see them once a month? Would you do they have I'm very ignorant about contemporary Korean Zen. Would you have private one-on-one meetings with them, like what we would call dokusan in Soto Zen? What was the teacher-student relationship like for you?
My understanding, which is It's limited. I'm not a scholar. My understanding, Barry, is that Korean Zen considers itself to be what's called Rinchi Zen, and that means Rinzai.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very Korean.
Mm-hmm.
They're clear about that. It came into Korea from China,
Mm-hmm.
the Chinese Chan monks and teachers. We did have one-on-one meetings, which were called interviews in English with the teacher. There wasn't any word in Korean. It was called just interview,
Mm-hmm.
and they were horrible and very, very frightening.
Mm-hmm.
Dharma combat all the way.
So they throw a koan at you.
Yes, and
Or an
again, it
excerpt
was
or
never
something.
called a koan. It was never discussed. It was never called anything.
Mm-hmm.
The teacher would give the student a question. I think the first question that he gave, in an attempt to immediately try to cut through conceptual junk, was, how did you come here? And of course, I said, well, I got interested in Zen and blah, blah, blah. And he had a giant stick and he would just slap it down and just shout very intimidatingly, wearing the full robes and all of that stuff. No, how did you come here? And I thought, I was trying to explain, this is terrifying, this is horrible. And I'd go back down, and we weren't supposed to compare notes with anyone else. We'd hear screams and thumps. It was terrifying coming from the upstairs. And yet there was something oddly compelling about it, because it was obviously pointing to something that I didn't know what the heck he was talking about. And of course, I'd read a lot of Zen stories about the Tang Dynasty masters hitting students, and then they become awakened. I was aware there was a tradition going on here that did presumably have possible good outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, we were trained early on not to bullshit. So the teacher said, if you don't know the answer to a question, don't try to cook anything up. Say, I do not know.
Mm-hmm.
Go up and say, I do not know. And he'd say, that's not good enough. You have to answer. And I think, what the heck? Very frustrating. And luckily, I was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and he mostly resided in Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
We did not see him that often, and he had not given Dharma transmission or teaching authorization to anyone.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, we would meditate, and we would do chanting and prostrations and services and serve our Sangha. And we even had whole retreats where if the teacher was not present, there were no Dharma talks and there were no one-on-one meetings or interviews. My understanding is that the Korean take on koan practice. Koan is a Japanese Zen word coming from a Chinese, kongan, I believe. And what the Koreans did was they took the koan or meditation question and they boiled it down to what's called the hwadu.
Like a key phrase.
Yes. Translated as word head or thought head, the head. So for instance, and they boiled it down to a very basic existential. It wasn't, there was a dog and blah, blah. It's not a story. They boiled it down to the basic questions of who am I and what is this, which are considered to be the same question. It's called imoko. And if you're working with it as an English speaker, you're concentrating either on what or who, standing for what is this or who am I, and you're concentrating on that day and night and day and all of your waking hours. I did that practice when I was in the Korean monastery for 8 months in 88 and had a very positive experience through it.
Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. I took the translation in English of the Hwadu as what is this?
Mm-hmm.
And my understanding the practice is that that's an inquiry into every phenomenon that comes into our perceptual awareness. We apply the Huadu and say, okay, what is this really? And the Vietnamese Zen master who recently passed, I think he's the greatest Buddhist teacher of our century, Thich Nhat Hanh, went into that in great detail from his point of view of his Vietnamese Zen training, where he gave hundreds and not probably thousands of Dharma talks and poems, and every way that he could, he just went at it to point out that we tend to operate through concepts and through ideas. However, names and forms are temporary. They're extremely provisional. An apple is going to taste the same whether you call it an apple in English or a pomme in French or a sagwa in Korean. And so what is the essence of appleness? What is it really? What is this? And you do that with everything, with your hand, with this microphone, cup of tea, doggy do, everything that you come into contact with in the world without discrimination that comes into your awareness as a thing, including me, where we practice this to, well, what is this really? And that, of course, opens up reality in a way you can bring it in through the door of science, you can bring it in through the door of geology, you can bring it through the door of various spiritual relationships to God as the creator. You can bring it through any damn door that you please, and it's always going to expand your world exponentially and point toward the unknown.
It's beautiful. Thank you.
It's a very good practice. And I recently, there's an organization called the Shift Network that brings together speakers and teachers and has various seminars. I was invited to be on a recent summit that the Shift Network organized with some very famous people, of which I'm not one, called the Mystics Summit. And I was interviewed for that on, interestingly, Zen and mysticism. And I had a chance to talk about that and to lead a small practice. And the practice that I chose was derived from Thich Nhat Hanh, and I would also say from Korean Zen Buddhism in the training. And I held up a piece of fruit and talked about what we might conventionally call it. I think it was a clementine or a mandarin citrus fruit. And then, however, that name and our concept of it in such a limited way is not the reality of whatever that thing is. And I began to deconstruct it and smell it and taste it and where it comes from had to have been grown. All of this, it had to come from a seed. Where did that seed come from? And I said, so just apply this to anything that you come into contact with in your daily life. Anything. It doesn't matter. It could be your cell phone, and ask, where did all of this come from? Where did it come from? And I said, rationally and scientifically, most likely, if you take it back far enough, it will have to go back to the origin of the universe. Something does not come out of nothing, as far as we know. Your glasses that you're wearing, where did they come from? Eye
Center. I'm just joking. No,
it did. That is a good answer. And then where did they get them? You see where I'm saying?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Yeah. Just, you don't have to be Buddhist and you don't have to be Zen. Ask yourself anything. Where did this pen come from? What is this really? It doesn't matter. For parents, look at your child. whether biological or adoptive. Where did you come from, you little thing?
So when you started Zen practice, you were kind of driven by satisfaction and not wanting to be depressed and anxious. Seems like your practice kind of transformed to more like what's going on? What's the meaning of this existence? Am I getting that right? Is it?
I started out asking what was the meaning of existence because that
Huh.
was what's making me depressed and anxious.
Okay.
What I wanted to be, Barry, was happier.
Hmm.
And I am genuinely a happier person.
So it worked.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Um, you at one point you got ordained, right, and took a vow of poverty. Could you talk about that? Like what led to that and why you did it and so forth?
Yes. I said I started my formal practice at the Zen Buddhist Temple of Ann Arbor, Michigan. It
Hmm.
was just starting up. The mother temple was established, was in Toronto.
Hmm.
And the teacher said, I want to have a temple in the United States. And the opportunity opened up for Ann Arbor
Hmm.
through various causes and conditions. That temple, like the one in Toronto, was modeled on the one in Toronto, and it had the core group were residents of what the teacher called lay monastics. He said, you're not really monastics and you're not lay people.
Hmm.
And we were total renunciates who moved into the temple, who lived there full time, served the Sangha who came from outside and came and went, the lay Sangha. We
Hmm.
had no money, we had no belongings, we had no privacy. It was a very radical and difficult way of life.
Hmm.
And it also enabled us as a community with no money to start this temple and renovate it from an old house, two-story house, into a beautiful temple, to save our money and do that because we only ate 2 meals a day,
Hmm.
generally vegan, though we didn't use that word. And we just lived at a complete poverty level and pooled our resources. And there you see the crossover between what we were calling the hippie era. Okay.
You froze up, so I paused it briefly. Go ahead, please.
So, so in my early training at the Zen Buddhist Temple Ann Arbor, for those of us who moved, as I did, into the temple as a total vow of poverty renunciate, no privacy, no
Hmm.
personal money, no personal anything. It was not a normal way of life for an American. However, I'd been living in poverty and working at several different jobs, and I thought, you know what? This is ridiculous. This is totally, I didn't have the word. These days we would say, this is non-sustainable.
Hmm.
I can't get, I'm broke all the time. And
Hmm.
I'm working all the time. And the time I'm not working, I'm at a Zen temple practicing. I might as well move into the temple and be poverty stricken there
Hmm.
because, yes, like most Americans, I was afraid of a lack of privacy. However, in my lay life, I was living outside the temple. I was using my apartment to try to raise the money to pay for the apartment and sleeping there. I wasn't getting that much enjoyment out of it.
Hmm.
I was living at the poverty level, so I thought I might as well be with other people and we could do something good. We will, through communal action, we will make a beautiful place of practice and we'll get to know each other. And I'll learn something about how people can live in ways that aren't individual, that that are collective.
Hmm.
So we had two groups. We had the core residential group, Vow of Poverty, and then we had lay members who came and went, had families,
Hmm.
came regularly or occasionally, and that was the way that we were structured.
How long did you live there?
I began practicing in the temple in 1980. I moved in May of 1983 under a vow of
Oh,
poverty,
you moved quick. Wow.
and I lived and practiced there until late in 85 when I
Mhm.
left and began a Dharma bum period of my life, traveling westward across the United States, visiting many Buddhist groups and practicing with a number of Zen groups.
Did any of those stand out to you?
They all did. I mean, they were all interesting.
Yeah. Why did you leave the residential community?
As an American citizen who
Hmm.
does believe in democratic process,
Hmm.
as a person of my age who went through the women's movement, there were many, many beautiful things. There are many beautiful things that I greatly appreciate
Hmm.
about my early Zen training. And it was a patriarchal and non-democratic form of governance and life of our community. And that did not sit well with me.
Hmm. I some of my female practice friends who say, you're talking about the hitting the stick and the yelling and
Oh, yeah.
in their opinion, and I have female friends that don't think this. So, I've heard both sides of it, and I think both points of view are valid. But they felt like the whole it's too masculine, too patriarchal. It's too male driven with this energy.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's kind of a guy thing.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, so you made it out to California eventually.
Mhm.
Yeah. Did you practice with it? Did you get deeply involved with any teachers out here?
Uh, I met teachers along the way,
Hmm.
and before I tried another North American Zen teacher, I thought, I have so many questions. How much of what I experienced was Korean? How much
Hmm.
of it was the teacher? How much of I didn't, nothing was ever explained. So I thought, I need answers. I need to go to the mothership. And that's in part why I went to South Korea, into the monastery there.
How
To
long did you practice there?
I was there for 8 months.
Hmm. Was that totally different?
Yes.
Hmm.
And I was not fluent in Korean.
Hmm.
So it's horrible culture shock and amazing. Spiritually, it was incredibly tough. I'm lucky to have gotten back alive and would never give it up for anything in the world. Well, I'll just be very frank with you.
Hmm.
And I won't go into detail because it is personal.
Hmm.
I did enter into the Korean system. I was given the first level, like a junior nun's ordination. I
Hmm.
went through that. They let me keep not let me keep, I wasn't calling the shots. They did not change my name, which was interesting.
Hmm.
Usually you're given another name, and they were like, Mushim is Korean, and they didn't say why. They didn't change my name. So I stayed that. I was Mushim Sinim, which means nun,
Hmm.
monastic. And it was very, very hard and very weird and very interesting. And the thing that saved me, I should have possibly left earlier. However, the writer and poet part of my brain said to me, you know what, Mushim, because I looked Korean to the Koreans.
Hmm.
If I kept my mouth shut, people did not know I was an American or a Japanese American. And
Hmm.
so the Koreans were more disposed to accept me
Hmm.
in a certain way than if I'd been white,
Hmm.
and certainly if I'd been black. It is a racist society, and and uh, and I kept thinking, if I can just survive this and get back to the United States and write about this, this will be amazing. I'm having an experience from like an anthropological or sociological point of view that very, very few Americans have had, and very few Koreans have had, because most Koreans are not Buddhist monastics. So I thought, I have entered into almost like a secret society or world that has experiences I'll never, ever have access to again. I have to stay here. And I stayed, and things did get very strange. And I came back flew into San Francisco Airport in August. The anniversary is coming up of 1988. And at that time, I had $15 to my name, no savings. My head was shaved. I was dressed in gray monastic clothing, and I was pregnant with my son.
And so that made monastic living a challenge, an impossibility, perhaps.
I would say so, yes.
Yeah. And did you move to the Bay Area right away?
I flew into San Francisco. One of my old friends, poet friends from graduate school, took me in, and from there I connected to other Buddhist friends I had established in this area, and who helped me. And I was able to give birth to my child with the help of Medi-Cal, the state aid for poor people, in the hospital in the North Bay area, and to, I don't know, get various forms of like food subsidies and things. I lived in very dire poverty, and with the help of friends, I was able to just keep clawing my way out of poverty, just one day at a time. And then when my child was a toddler, we moved here to from Marin County to Oakland, actually into the apartment where I am now, with a man that I was dating who became my husband and is now my ex-husband. And I, excuse me, and I stabilized just enough to think, I think I'm ready to start doing Zen practice again. Give me a sec. And at that point, I connected with the local chapter of the California Diamond Sangha because of my old friend Robert Aitken Roshi, whom I met when my child was a baby. He loves children. And he became my friend on one of his trips to the Bay Area. And he had a number of Dharma airs, and one of them had a small meditation group in Berkeley, which is adjacent to Oakland where I live. And he was, I guess, the next to last Zen teacher with whom I studied, and that was John Tarrant Roshi.
Did you do koans with him? How did you like that style of practice compared to the Korean style that you had done?
It was similar. And the power dynamics were similar too, which is why I gave it a go. And then I thought, this feels very familiar. And Barry, I do want to emphasize, I've given a number of Dharma talks recently in reminiscing and looking back to my time with my original teacher. He actually, while being overbearing, patriarchal, bossy, all of that kind of stuff, dictatorial, as a spiritual teacher, as a Zen master, if we want to use that term, he gave me the key to the kingdom almost immediately. Unbelievable compassion and kindness. Very soon after starting the one-on-one interviews with him, We didn't see him often again. However, he moved to Ann Arbor from Toronto right after I moved into the temple, and he said, "We're now ready to have a 3-month silent meditation retreat. I've been waiting for the right time, and now the time is right. And we're going to have this, and we're going to get up even earlier." And I had thought, oh my gosh, really? I don't even like to get up early anyway. And we're going to be meditating all the time and no talking. And this is horrible, but it was too late. I'd given everything away and I'd moved in. So there I was. We had this first 3-month silent meditation retreat in Korea. They call it a Youngmin Junction. It's the summer one, or the so-called Rains retreat. It's very traditional. So we had a lot of interviews with the teacher, like every single day, except for Sunday maybe. And like 6 days, it was terrifying. And I thought, I have jumped from the frying pan into the fryer. So he gave me some question which I couldn't answer, and I'd meditate, and I'd go up and I tried this and I tried that, and I tried, and I kept getting with the yelling and the pounding and the terrifying screaming and the get out of here. And I finally got to my wit's end. I bottomed out. And I was angry. I was desperate. I was also kind of uncaring. I was like, fuck you. Why do we have to go through this? Just tell me the damn answer. I'm a good student. I will learn things. Give me some instruction. And in that state of mind, I went up and we went head to head. And the question was asked. And I looked at him. I don't think I even said anything. I looked at him and I was just really angry and frustrated. Like, just give me the goods, dude. This is ridiculous. Stop beating around the bush. Stop playing games. Give me the answer to this question. And he looked at me, and in the coldest, most condescending, nastiest voice you could ever think of, he said to me, "Do you think that I know?" And luckily I did not have a loaded gun, because I looked at him thinking, of course you know. Why else would you have given me this question that I'm desperately trying to? You are the enlightened Zen teacher. I'm the unenlightened, ignorant Zen student. Of course you know the answer. And he said, he didn't say he didn't know the answer. However, he said, "Do you think I know the answer?" And then I got it, Barry. And I thought, we're very different people. You're Korean. You grew up during the Korean War. All of your experience has been completely different from mine. I'm an American citizen. I'm a woman. I've got a college education. We don't speak the same languages, really. In terms of our first languages, our experience is hardly anything alike. Of course, you would not know the answers to what is the meaning of my life, what is my path, where will I go, what will I do with my life. Of course, you don't know the meaning to that. And even though you're saying it in this very nasty way, this is a statement of liberation. And looking back on that, I thought, wow, that was incredible.
Thank you. That's one of the coolest stories I've heard in all all these podcasts I've done. I really appreciate that.
It was totally cool. And of course, it took me many years to go through, because I kept projecting outward. Well, these people must know the answers, and these people must know the answers. And the fact was, people do have answers and things to teach. It's not a fruitless search at all. All the things I learned in Korea, totally wonderful. However, the answer to the basic existential questions of the human being, who am I? What is the universe? And what is my place? What is my purpose of my life? Those cannot, in an existentialist sense, they can't be given to us by another person. You can only find that for yourself. And in that lies our freedom.
Mhm. That's amazing. Thank you. How long did you work with John Tarrant before moving on?
Maybe 2.5 years.
Mhm. And then
And again, he didn't live near us in the East Bay.
Mhm.
He would travel down.
From like Sonoma or something, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
just every once in a while.
Mhm. Did you ever meet James Ford during that era? I think you were.
I did.
Yeah.
I did, and I'm connected to him on Facebook. And what it was is that Robert Aitken Roshi, the founder of the Diamond Sangha in the United States, came to visit,
Mhm.
and one of the part of that network, they were having a jukai precept ceremony in some city, I don't know, in the Bay Area.
Mhm.
And Aitken Roshi said, do you and your baby son, he loved babies, so he loved my child. He said, do you want to come with us? And I thought, sure, that might be fun.
Mhm.
And as I recall, I think James Ford was at that Jukai ceremony.
Mhm. Oh, cool. And so you described Tarrant as your next to last teacher. Who was your last? Or did I understand that right?
Yes, I would say my last Zen teacher after that was Norman Fisher,
Oh, okay.
who founder of Everyday Zen,
Mhm.
devoted father of two children, twin sons who babysat my kid sometimes. We lived for a year at Green Gulch Zen Center, which is
Oh, you
part of
did.
San Francisco Zen Center, yes.
Uh-huh.
And Norman Fisher and his family were there.
This is when he was Abbott then.
No, it was before he was abbot.
Oh, before he was Abbott. Okay.
However, at that point in time, he was, I think the position's called Tanto. He was
Uh-huh.
head of the meditation hall,
Mhm.
and
Well,
he was the
that's
only,
Tonto is like the practice boss of the.
yes,
Yeah.
practice boss.
Yeah.
And he was the only reliable, uh, outside of a designated childcare time, he was the only reliable babysitter I ever found there.
Yeah. Great.
So we had a really, I would say, from my point of view, wonderful relationship. And once again, even then, he was closely examining the rituals,
Mhm.
all of that kind of monastic crossover stuff in application to he's such a wonderful family person.
Mhm.
And I think that led him to found Everyday Zen, which I later connected to after I'd moved to Oakland. I heard that
Mhm.
they were doing a 1 day mini Rohatsu retreat. So I signed up for it. And I went into the interview or the Dokusan room and said, hi, Norman. And I hadn't seen him in a long time. And we just kept everyone else waiting and had this long chat. It was so rude. It was like 20 minutes in there. And I remember that I feel he's such a person, in my point of view, of such integrity, such a great guy, great Zen teacher, very down to earth. And he said, well, what have you been up to? And I said, I've become involved in a group of Buddhists who are doing anti-racism work.
Mhm.
And I remember he looked at me and he said, oh, that's your karma. That's what you have to do.
Mhm.
And I thought, why are you telling me what I have to do? Getting all bossy.
Mhm.
However, it was entirely true.
Mhm.
And I appreciate it so much because he didn't say, oh, that's political stuff.
Mhm.
No, no, no. You have to do more Zen sitting and you have to do this and you have to do more formal practice. Instead, he said, oh, no. He said, in fact, he said, that's your karma.
Yeah. And maybe
That's what
translated, that feels right.
for him,
Yeah.
that was his perception of my path. He was
Mhm.
right on the money. And later on, though he wasn't my teacher, I connected to a Korean Zen monk who founded a temple over in Berkeley, adjacent to Oakland, called the Sixth Patriarch Zen Temple. And he was learning some English. And I ran into him one time in Berkeley at a park where he was taking English as a second language, and my child was doing some art lessons over the summer. So we sat down for a cup of coffee, and I thought he would tell me, oh, Mushim, you have to do more Zen practice. You have to do more sitting, sit, 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 sit. He said nothing of the kind. He said, he had met my child, and he said, through your child's curiosity, you will grow to understand the world.
Yes.
So my understanding was, he said, your path of practice is now to be the best mother you can be and to foster your child's education. And actually, before that, when I was pregnant, and before that, I had checked out Joshu Sasaki Roshi, who was a Rinzai, Japanese Zen master, very old even then. And he lived to be super old. He died only a few years ago, and spoke limited English. Dharma combat, again, the whole koan thing. I went in, his staff had told him I was pregnant, and he just instantly changed my koan to, how do you manifest Buddha nature or true nature as baby? And that was the most wonderful koan I've ever had, because I was pregnant, and I'm telling you, my child and I had all of this. He loved Zen practice. He loved, well, he didn't have to do the work. He loved the drumming. He loved the chanting. He loved the zazen. And he could communicate all of that to me. And I went into the Dokusan, they call it the Sanzen room. And I remember that Sasaki Roshi said to me in his elementary English, he said, you must educate baby. And I've been doing all these hours of zazen, so it didn't translate in my brain to, oh, save up your money and find a way to get him into college and get him a better education. What I heard it was like God speaking to me saying, your sole purpose in life is to give this child a spiritual education. And I said, who am I to say no to God? I shall go forth and do my best. So you see, I had this wonderful Zen instruction, which was about not doing Zen. It was about being a good mommy.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about, to kind of sum up here or finish up here, could you talk a little bit about how you got involved with the East Bay meditation group or
yes, meditation center.
Yeah, meditation center.
EBMC, East Bay Meditation Center. Yes, I certainly can. The East Bay Meditation Center was incorporated as a nonprofit 501c3 or church under the name East Bay Dharma Center prior to many years. In fact, I think before 2007, which is when we actually opened our doors. And I became aware of this group because some of my friends were involved in it, and I was asked to be on their board of directors twice before they had a physical space. And I said, there is no way. I was on the board of the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. I was on the board of San Francisco Zen Center. And I knew how much work it was. It was totally unpaid. Again, I'm living in poverty and trying to raise this kid and dig myself out of poverty. I thought, no, you're not going to get me to work for free. You must be insane, because you don't even have a place and you're not conducting meditation sessions. Go away. Then they asked me a third time in 2006 or early 2007, and they had found a place, a one-room storefront on Broadway at 22nd in downtown Oakland. And one of my best friends, teacher Larry Yang, was on the board, and he does not waste his time and is a magnificent organizer. And I thought, conditions are now right. I will say yes to being on your board of directors.
Mm-hmm.
Thus, I became one of 6 members of the board of directors, now called the Leadership or El Sangha of East Bay Meditation Center. I joined them in March of 2007, a few months after we opened our doors, which we did for the Martin Luther King Jr. birthday holiday weekend. And you see our roots, everything about us is rooted in the United States justice-centered movement.
Mm-hmm.
In that case, paying homage to the civil rights era,
Mm-hmm.
what led on to become Black Lives Matter, movement for Black lives. And also, Dr. King was obviously not a Buddhist, as well as a mission that was what we called was a celebration of, we said we were founded in a celebration of diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And I was on that original member board of directors. There were 6 of us, and we did everything. We were, most of us were teachers. We would teach the Dharma and meditation. We cleaned the center. We stocked the center. We installed the computer in the little office. Larry Yang and I went to IKEA and bought furniture.
Mm-hmm.
You get we took garbage home in our cars because we didn't have contract with someone to take away the garbage and recycling. We
Mm-hmm.
did everything.
Mm-hmm.
And because my training is to help to start temples from scratch, this felt very familiar to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved it. I loved that joyful spirit of people from the community saying, "Oh, do you need a hand? Could I help you?" I remember I got an email from someone. We had a little supply closet. I mean, tiny, few shelves for toilet paper and tea and that kind of thing. And a person said, "I would like to volunteer to manage your inventory and to restock the supplies." And she said, "But I don't know if I'm well qualified enough. Let me send you my resume." And she had been in charge of an industrial warehouse for a number of years. And I said, I think you're well qualified enough.
Mm-hmm.
So I love that spirit, Barry, of that startup energy of when you don't have much, that's when people come together and say, "Can I help you?
Mm-hmm.
Can I donate this?
Mm-hmm.
Can I help out with that?" People would say, "I can do spreadsheets and stuff. Can I be an office assistant? Can I help clean things up and put things away?" People donated things for the altar. And to see something beautiful come out of nothing from a community which becomes beautiful as the temple becomes beautiful, that is really what I am about.
That's awesome. Cool. That sounds like a good stopping place. What do you think?
A very good place to rest our conversation. I in
Okay.
particular want to thank you, Barry, for in diversity, equity, and inclusion work. We would say that you have showed up as an ally to
Mm-hmm.
me as an Asian American and as a Japanese American by asking questions about my experience instead of stating assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that I have to say, unfortunately, I don't encounter all that often.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel very grateful to you for your sensitivity and for your openness.
So, thank you for saying that. I'm sure I can get much better in that respect, though. I mean,
We all can. I need to be a better ally to people who have a different cultural experience than I do.
yeah, I found of all the conditionings, cultural conditioning is the most opaque and hard to see in ourselves.
We say in diversity, equity, inclusion work, the fish cannot see the water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much. This was every bit as fun and interesting as I thought it would be, and I thank you so much for your time.
Let's stay in touch.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
definitely. Thank you.